Alright, just to finish up our previous video, we left off in a discussion of whether this pasuk, Som Tasim Alecha Melech, is a command, you must appoint a king, or it's something optional. You may appoint a king in accordance with these restrictions, that Hashem will choose the king, and the king not be an Ish Nochri, and the king not violate all these rules. So until now we saw two extreme perspectives on this. Recall that Rambam thought it was a mandatory obligation, mitzvat aseh, to appoint a king. Ibn Ezra instead used the word reshut, optional, and Abarbanel really ran with that and said not only is it only optional, not only is it not a mandatory mitzvah to appoint a king, but in fact it's a bad idea to appoint a king. And so to the extent that you see any sort of a mitzvah element in having a king, Abarbanel says the mitzvot associated with a king are like the mitzvah of doing tshuva. You're not supposed to sin, but if you sin, you have a mitzvah to do tshuva, so too you're not really supposed to appoint a king. But if you find yourself in a situation where you feel you need a king, you're going to do it anyway, there's a mitzvah at that point to only do it, to only appoint a king who obeys all these restrictions. But better yet would be to not have a king at all. The Netziv, who we're going to talk about in this video, tries to take a sort of middle ground. The Netziv lives much later than all the other people we quoted. Rambam and Ibn Ezra both lived in the 1100s. Abarbanel, we mentioned, was alive in 1492 when the Jews were kicked out of Spain. Netziv lives in the 1800s, much later. And by his time, there is such a thing as democratic countries. There are different forms of government that the medieval Meforshim were not even aware of. And the Netziv revisits this issue. And the Netziv is aware that Rambam is generally seen as the most authoritative halachic figure of the people we mentioned. Between Rambam, Ibn Ezra, and Abarbanel, Rambam's the one who's a real halachic authority. And he said it's a mitzvah. So Netziv kind of feels stuck within that position that it's a mitzvah to have a king. On the other hand, he's aware that there are all these other different forms of government out there. So says the Netziv, he tries to walk a tightrope here. That's why I said he holds it's complicated. He says, he says this language, this lashon, this language of Som Tasim Alecha could mean that it's not an absolute mitzvah, but rather a reshut. So in that he agrees with Ibn Ezra, that a simple reading of the words in the Torah, a simple reading of the phrase Som Tasim Alecha Melech would be that it's a reshut, it's optional. Similar, for example, to the fact that there are certain rules regarding how we're allowed to prepare kosher meat. So the Torah talks about someone saying, "V'amarta ochla basar." What happens if someone will say, "I want to eat meat"? So the Torah says if you want to eat meat, there are a bunch of ways that you have to prepare it. It doesn't mean you have to eat meat. You could be a vegetarian, and then you'll never have to deal at all with shchita or salting the meat or anything like that. So Netziv says a simple reading of the pasuk is that it's a reshut, like Ibn Ezra says. But yadua b'divrei Chazal the mitzvah lo not melech. Everybody knows that according to Chazal, according to the Gemara, which is what Rambam ruled like, what we presented as Rambam's view, according to the normative halachic view, it is a mitzvah. So how do we balance that? Imken the Maktiv ve'amarta, says the Netziv, if really bottom line is that according to the Gemara, and we said the Rambam, the halacha is that there's a mitzvah to appoint a king, why is it phrased like ve'amarta asima alai melech? If you'll say that you want a king, then you can have a king of this way. If Rambam's right, and Netziv assumes Rambam is right, that there's a mitzvah to appoint a king, why not come out and say you have to have a king? Why instead does the Torah kind of tiptoe around it and say, well, if you say you want a king, if you say ve'amarta, then appoint this type of king that God chooses? Says the Netziv, mishum dehanhagat hamedina mishtanet. He says, because the truth is, hanhagat hamedina, leading a country, what we call governing, can vary. Im inhagat al pidat melucha, should the country be run by the opinions of the melucha, the king, the royal family? Al pidat ha'am v'nivcharehem, or maybe a country should be governed by the will of the people and their elected ones, their chosen ones, the elected officials. Right? And Netziv is aware that you don't have to have a king to have a strong national government. You could have a president and a Congress instead. V'yesh medina she'ena yechola lispol dat melucha. In fact, certain countries can't tolerate a king, right? And Netziv's in the 800s. He's living in Eastern Europe, but he knows, presumably, that there are places like the United States, which used to be ruled by a king in the 1700s, and we threw him out, right? We had a revolution to get rid of him. But in Netziv's time, there are some democratic countries in Europe as well. And so there are countries that can't tolerate a king. On the other hand, the Netziv himself lives under the Tsar in Russia, so it's still normal to him to live under a monarch. So the Netziv, Yesh Medina shebelo melech harei kisfina belo kfarnit. There are countries that if they live without a king, they're going to be like a ship without a captain. Some countries really need that strong leadership in order to maintain law and order. That's been discussed about certain of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa where America has meddled over your lifetimes, over the last 10, 15 years. Certain of these countries, it's very nice that America tried to bring them democracy, but they didn't necessarily realize the dynamics of those countries. So let's say in Libya, for example, Gaddafi, who was a horrible person. He was a dictator who, at various points, murdered his own people. But he did understand that it was sort of this tribal society where different areas were ruled by individual tribal chiefs, and he had this ability to unite all those chiefs under him. So America came and got rid of him, and I don't feel bad for the guy that he was gotten rid of. He was a horrible person. But on the flip side, America created this reality of chaos there by getting rid of him. So Libya today looks very much like a ship without a captain, kisfina b'li kfarnit. It's not a functioning democratic country. Instead, it's what we call a failed state. Says the Netziv, depending on the society, there are societies that are better off without a king. A king doesn't do well for them. And there are places where some sort of a strong national leader like a king actually is good for them. Otherwise, in certain places, the only alternative to the king is chaos, like a ship without a captain. And so this issue, this matter of whether to be ruled by a king or some other form of government, therefore cannot be done al pi hechreach mitzvah aseh. Hechreach means something that's forced or coerced. This can't be done through coercion by forcing you a mandatory mitzvah aseh, the same way that men have to put on tefillin in the morning, in the same way that men and women have to eat Pesach at the Seder night. You have to have a king. The Torah can't say it that way, because what if you live in a time and place where in your society a king would be a disaster? Or if we tried to introduce a king to the United States, it would probably spark another civil war. So the Torah can't tell us it's a mitzvah to say we have to have a king here. Says the Netziv, we know in general that you're not obligated to do mitzvah at risk of your own life, except with a couple of exceptions. So say, I have to put on tefillin every morning, but I don't have to put on tefillin if I'm in a place where there's some horrible anti-Semite standing over me with a gun who's going to shoot me if I put tefillin on. So, says the Netziv, appointing a king can be kind of like that. It's a mitzvah. In theory, you're supposed to have a king. But if you live in a time and place where trying to appoint a king could cost you your life or cost someone else their life, that type of issue, hanhagat klal, governing the masses, governing a country, can touch upon sakanat nefashot, life-threatening dangers. Sakana means danger. It can touch upon life-threatening danger, where if we try to impose a king on a society that's not meant to have a king, then the people who don't want a king are going to fight back, and they're going to shoot at us, we're going to shoot back, lots of people are going to die. And that's docha mitzvah to say, that takes precedence, or protecting human life takes precedence over fulfilling this mitzvah. Therefore, says the Netziv, bottom line, therefore, says the Netziv, in theory it's a mitzvah, but you can't command it like an absolute mitzvah so long as there's not a consensus of the people to tolerate the burden of a king. Okay? And so the Netziv, like I said, it's complicated. On the one hand, if you'd ask the Netziv, if you're trying to make a count, a tally of the 613 mitzvot, does this count as one of them? The Netziv would say yes. Just like the Rambam, who made a count of the 613 mitzvot, he said it counted too. It was positive commandment number 183 on his list. If Ibn Ezra were to make a count of the 613 mitzvot, he would not count it. Neither would a Barbanel. So the Netziv, in that regard, agrees with the Rambam against Ibn Ezra and a Barbanel. And the reason, which we didn't really do in class, is that a simple reading of the Gemara is like the Rambam. So Netziv says that Chazal basically think like the Rambam. They think in the count of 613 mitzvot, appointing a king is one of them. In that sense, it's an absolute mitzvah like Rambam. But what the Netziv says that Rambam didn't say is that it's a mitzvah that you don't have to fulfill if it will put your life in danger. Now that's kind of true of all positive mitzvot. You also don't have to put on tefillin, or eat matzah, or shake a lulav, or blow shofar. You don't have to do any of them if your life's going to be in danger by doing them. But the Netziv is saying appointing a king is different because when it comes to appointing a king, the danger is inherent in the idea of trying to appoint a king. Inherent in the idea of trying to impose a certain form of government is that you could spark a war that way. You could spark a civil war that way, a revolt. And so, unlike lulav or shofar or tefillin, where the Torah basically said, go do it. We all know that means go do it unless you're going to get killed because you're living in some horrible country where they'll kill Jews for wearing tefillin. The Torah doesn't have to say that, because normally, most of us, thank God, do not live in places like that. And so the normal way it works with the mitzvah of tefillin is that if you're a man, a Jewish man, you have to put tefillin on. And there's this rare exception if you're in a place where that might cost you your life. The way matzah normally works is you have to eat matzah if you're a Jewish man or woman. But appointing a king, it's not at all unusual that trying to force a society to have a king could spark a war. So the Torah gave it to us as a mitzvah, but when the Torah formulated it, instead of saying go do it, the Torah said, if you'll say, I want a king. Now, the Torah said you should do this, but only if the society says, if there's a consensus in the society that we want a king. Because any time that no such consensus exists, it's obviously going to be dangerous to try and impose it. And so the only time this mitzvah is gonna apply is when there is that haskama ta'am, that consensus of the people, the will of the people is to have a king.